We need to talk about something interesting.
Alright, welcome back to our ongoing discussion of Puella Magi Madoka Magica. We're on episode 6. But before we get into the episode, I do want to go through a number of housekeeping things because some really cool stuff. First, I guested on my friends, the Anime Summit, and their podcast. We're talking about Mecha, which of course I know nothing about. But they told me that was the joke and we went with it, so I'll leave a link down below and definitely go check them out. I love those guys, they're great friends, and I was ever so happy to be a guest on their podcast. Please go subscribe to their channel, it's worth it. And the episode we did was pretty darn great, if I do say so myself. That is not the end of my guest spots this month, though. I did a little bit for my friend Tyranno's YouTube channel. He's doing a video on all the Pretty Cure seasons, and I hopped in for Hugto Pretty Cure, giving a little bit about George Karai and how he foils Hana in that show. Tyranno's a great friend with a great analytical mind, so go sub to his channel and watch all of his Pretty Cure videos. Yet one more interaction from a content creator, but in a different vein. In episode 1.5 near the end, I made an offhand reference to an analytical work of literature called The Very Soil. The author, Jen A. Blue, reached out and connected on Twitter. So I'd like to go back and mention that some of the ideas that I'm taking from this series are pulled from other sources like The Very Soil, and I'd highly recommend getting the book if you're interested on takes on the extended media franchise or of Rebellion that are nonetheless analytical but a bit different from my own. Alright, that out of the way, comments. My favorite comment from the last episode was by Sadiq Samaus, who responds to the idea that we're rejecting the perfect logistician's argument and that we're not fucking with the genie here in Madoka Magica by saying that's absolutely what Toku Nemo and Ui did in Magia Record. And yeah, spoilers, I guess, for a mobile game that you probably shouldn't play because the gameplay's not that great and is now shut down because the North American release was a blatant cash grab. But yeah, the entire thing in Magia Record is that these two genius girls kind of mess with Kyubei's powers and take that from him and create their own space with the rumors, and it's a whole thing. And it brings up something that I largely want to talk about in relation to Rebellion, about how Urobuchi has somehow infused Madoka Magica with this kind of mystery thriller vibe of this unknown information, and then we have to kind of work backwards to piece together what happened. And for the context of the original series, that's, everything in episode 10 and with Homura. But then in Rebellion, it's that whole thing of Homura is given this idyllic magical girl life and this classic magical girl series, and she knows it's wrong because of these things, and she has to kind of work backwards in the flaming pus and, all that goes into that. And then in Magia Record, it's this unknown information, and they have to come up with all this stuff about the rumors, about a new city, about this Kyubei that can't talk, to be able to set up these plot devices in this kind of psychopath thriller kind of vibe. And yeah, maybe there's some value to that. Maybe you can find somebody who's a big fan of Urobuchi as thriller writer or twist master, and they can give you a breakdown on how each of those series goes and how that adds value to whatever Madoka Magica brings to the table, but I'm not that person. I can only tell you the value towards the magical girl genre and what the inversions, what that putting off the catharsis does, what the mystery adds to the classic magical girl tropes and how they are inverted. In that way, I will say kind of definitively that the fucking with the genie that happens in Magia Record is just so not the character-based drama that I'm looking for. Although Magia Record, to its credit, does have a bit of that, with Iroha founding some relationships with Yachio and the other girls. It just doesn't add up or come together in the way that it does with Madoka Magica. It's kind of like watching Ruby or Yuki Yuna as a hero, where you're just like, okay, I can kind of see that you're getting there, where like you had good intentions, but it just doesn't get there. Michael Worthy on YouTube pointed out something, the top-down view of Kyubei and Sayaka contracting, they're literally standing in the center of a labyrinth. That's a pretty good take, and we can use that to draw a couple more conclusions. By labeling the witch's home as a labyrinth, it gives the impression that the witches inside are somehow lost in it. Furthermore, it implies that it's constructed. It's somebody else putting them in a labyrinth, which is definitely the case. And it has this implied equation to the dangerous beast of the Minotaur. I think the most prominent for me is the fact that the girls feel lost when they transform into a witch. They've lost their way. Sayaka in particular, especially after seeing the path she has chosen to walk in episode 5 and knowing how she's going to go about losing that. It does really feel like a path that was lost or strayed from or taken a wrong turn that could have come out correctly, but it was just too difficult a maze to navigate, and so she turns into a witch. Yeah, a really, really good symbol. Art on YouTube leaves a good comment with a couple different points. First, that Shaft had some coin before Madoka Magica, and in some way, yeah, that I kind of see that they're taking a risk on an original anime, right? And it's only after Shinbo has proven himself that he has the sway to be able to do this, and after Shaft, as studio, is financially solvent enough to take a risk on something like this. Still, at the same time, Hidamari's sketch and Panty Pony Dash don't pay the fucking bills in the way that you may think. With those two things combined, we probably owe a bit more respect to Bakemonogatari for making Madoka Magica even possible. They also state that Madoka's bow looks like the staff of Caduceus, which absolutely it really does. The healer staff, right? A pretty straightforward symbol, but still a very good one. And then finally they comment that the recap movies kind of made a number of questionable choices when recapping the show. And yeah, I 100% agree on this one. My favorite shot of the entire show is Kyoko and Octavia's blood mixing together and then their forms embracing in the colors after they're both wounded in episode 9. And that shot does not appear at all in the recap movies. And I think it's one of a few examples where the recap movies just substantially have worse directing than the original show. While we're on the topic of Kyoko, one of the episode 5 omissions that I caught was that I failed to mention that Kyoko's countenance completely changes once Sayaka mentions mommy. Specifically, she says, "Mommy is gone because of magical girls like you." I think this is yet another example of really great series planning that maybe at the time they didn't have a different story done, but they had at least the idea that Kyoko and mommy had some sort of backstory, and that would be incredibly offensive to Kyoko because it completely misrepresents her philosophy, and her history with mommy, and is a really wonderful example to what we were talking about before of lack of communication being the critical flaw here. Staying with Kyoko, a quick hit from Lixie O'Rourke saying, one thing about Kyoko's design, that her dress and skirt kind of remind of curtains. And yeah, I sort of agree. I don't know if it's a direct comparison to the intro scene for the series, but it definitely is kind of, I think, showing Kyoko in not just a hard and fast battle-ready mode, that she still has those qualities of, a Madoka frilly dress aspect to her, that she can still have those magical girl values in that way too, symbolically. Her costume isn't 100% all in on the fighting or on the animal instinct. It still has a bit of Cardcaptor Sakura in it. Another comment from Username on YouTube brings up the diegetic distance and how they see it in the Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya. I actually went through the Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya as my first one of these breakdowns, and yeah, it wasn't thinking directly about that at the time, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely really used in a really cool way in that one. So you can check out my videos regarding that movie, or my eulogy video for the people who worked on it who passed away on my channel. The user Arc questions my preference for dub over sub. That's really a much larger topic that would probably take a full 20-minute video in its own, but the gist of it is I really don't like reading. Specifically, Tatami Galaxy and the Monogatari franchise are both anime that I think suffer immensely by having to read subtitles. And I said for both of them that I would be happy to revisit them whenever a dub comes out for them, so that I'm able to pay attention to what's going on screen more. And I have been literally laughed at for that opinion, but I still have it. So to talk generally more about dub versus sub, I would much rather listen to it in English. I think that's the way it's intended to be viewed. That is, auditorially, not reading, or else it would be a silent movie. But I completely understand the concept of separating the two, that it's a completely different work, that the English dub of Madoka Magica is a separate version, and you kind of have to treat it as such, which I think we generally do in these breakdowns, and I've already made a number of points where the translation's either been really bad or has improved the show, or the delivery in English has been better or worse, and I'd like to continue doing that because I think it provides some perspective. Also, I'm a big Christina V fanboy, so take that for what you will. And then finally, before we get into the episode, anonymous YouTuber comes in with, what do you think of the design of the soul gems and the grief seeds, that they have this Victorian-esque kind of aesthetic to them? And that's probably something we should talk about later in this episode when we see the realization of what the grief seeds really are or what the soul gems really are. But just to mention it now, I think that I really want to take it as a genre piece, that the pink compact or the little trinket that predates even the magical warrior genre with Sailor Moon and way back into, Minky Momo and the like. It's one element that we need to have in a magical girl show to be able to sell plastic toys to young girls. The specific design elements that make the gems kind of different and stand out against the rest of the genre, I think really reflect and show the purpose of the gems as the character's soul. They feel more regal, more important, and more kind of really integral to the characters than anything like a pre-cured cell phone or something. What's more, I think that they're so depressing and are used in such a malicious way because they represent the objectification and the embodiment of the character's desires and wishes. They're much more than a shiny trinket that allows you to transform. Again, hold that thought until we see the final scene of this episode. Did I use footage of the glitter force transformation scene? God, oh my god, fuck bowdlerized fucking bullshit. The first thing we should notice here is that we're beginning the episode in media res, that we are right in the middle of the fight that we saw last time. Even the shots of Sayaka being struck down and the reflection in her sword, that's very good. And then the money shot we noticed last time about Kyoko with the eye. The directionality here is very much downwards, that this is falling. Characters are moving across the screen, it's fast. So we're kind of plummeting down the roller coaster ride now that we're on the descent of Madoka Magica. And we still have that aspect of, hey, this happened last episode. Not in a scene that we didn't see last episode, like the start of episode 5 was, but it's still the same type of thing. Previously on Puella Magi Madoka Magica, Sakura Kyoko confronts the newly minted magical girl Sayaka Miki, and the two clash. But the uptight battle rhythm of the Congo drums completely vanishes when Homura does her signature hair flip. The music stopping goes very much along with her stopping time, and the pacing being thrown out of whack here. And I can't help but think of Sailor Neptune when you see such a stylish hair flip. But this is all a pacing break on the confrontation. While Kyoko and Sayaka were invested heavily in fighting each other, Homura is not troubled to the point where she can flip her hair on her entrance and stop the fight. It's a really good way of showing the relative power levels here, and Kyoko will later react to this. You can see the power level thing manifested when Homura karate chop KOs Sayaka, but also you can see the mystery behind Homura being hinted at or poked at with Kyoko's words. Her lines imply that Homura may not necessarily be stronger than the other girls, just that she is unknown. And once she figures it out, Kyoko would most likely be able to take down Homura. We mentioned it a bit in the previous episode, but I really want to harken back to the Sayaka Homura scene in Rebellion, where instead of, getting completely chopped up by Homura like she does here, blindsided, Sayaka is able to stop Homura's time stopping by thrusting the point of her sword into the gears of her shield. What a symbol of growth there if you compare those two actions. And it further matches the implications of Kyoko's threats. Homura's line of, "I'm on the side of those who think rationally." It's pretty funny because, yeah, in some ways she's definitely acting purely rationally. But as we've already established, the only way out of this hell that they're in is to act irrationally and truly believe it. Miracles and magic don't come from logic. I also want to say that they pull one of my favorite directing tricks, which is the confrontation face-on, where all you need to do is have just a bit of dialogue showing that they have contrasting positions, which they do with the dialogue between Homura and Kyoko here. And then all you need to do is just have a couple shots of people's faces. Then it gives enough time for the viewer to understand that the characters are making some sort of judgment, that they're opposed, right? But then no dialogue needs to be said past that. It's a great moment of show don't tell. We have everything that we need to know about what's going on in Kyoko's mind here because we're not complete idiots and we're invested in the story. So many shows, especially those lacking in a certain level of writing skill, would not have the patience or the trust in the viewer to let this play out. They'd fill the dialogue here of like Kyoko saying, saying, wow, I don't really understand how you're able to move that fast. I don't think I can fight this right now. Instead, we understand implied threats. We understand Kyoko is not picking fights she can't win. She's not stupid in that way like Sayaka is. All she says is keep your secrets, mystery girl. And that's enough to imply everything else. And then very quickly, the lighting remains the same as it has for most of the episodes. This is really important only because that this entire episode is either going to be this yellow of the sunset, yellows and orange, or the blues of nighttime. And it really contrasts with the opening and showing a different show entirely that has a completely different color palette. As we drift further and further away from that and further into a tragedy. Homer again has some really abrasive words for Madoka here. And I think the visuals on screen match perfectly where Homer doesn't even look at Madoka for the entire scene. But this kind of further shows the idea that we've been talking all about, the idea that this is not a magical girl show right now because Homura's mindset isn't allowing it to be. She doesn't attempt to support Madoka's viewpoint, she doesn't attempt to understand or empathize or appreciate Madoka and her compassion towards Sayaka in any way. In fact, she does the exact opposite, berating Madoka for those values. We see quite a bit later that her actual actions are a bit different than what her words say. Honestly, for most decently written magical girl shows, this is the viewpoint held by the villain. In the vein of a Black Moon Clan or an Akio Otori, Homer is so far past even the anti-hero magical girl, she's well into direct opposition of the genre. I think this is crucial here because not only is it the complete inversion of what we would expect and, you know, the reason why this feels like not a magical girl show, but also because it's character-based. It's Homura's mindset at the beginning of the series of Madoka Magica. And for her character arc to work over the course of the show, and in episode 12, when she bends down and, you know, says to Tatsuya, yes, Madoka, when she is shown with the rosewood bow later, having taken up the mantle of what Madoka's values were, this is the character arc that she goes through. She realizes that those do have value, that they do have power, that falling on the sword can create something larger than rational thought. And that's why Homura transforms as a character, or why she grows as a character. That's why it's a magical girl show at all. Because what Homura says here is going to be shown false, be disproven by Madoka in episode 12. And Madoka's classic magical girl values will be even more enforced or reinforced by having gone through the struggle that Homer presents to them in this show. And the only reason Homer works as a character at all is because she fails. Because her values here obviously aren't the truth. And this is largely why the last 20 minutes of Rebellion fail as a character bit. Homucifer is exactly the same as Homura in this episode. So there's no growth, or all that growth gets wiped away. Anyway, again, that's more for another video. After the opening, which at this point kind of seems like a mocking farce, I love this little shot here of the name on the front of the apartment, because it goes back to that setting and diegesis angle that somebody's holding up a little flashcard that reads Sayaka Miki. We don't need that shot to know that it's Sayaka in the next scene. We see her soul gem right away, and it then serves no purpose for identifying the character. So the only reasons left to include a shot like that is for that diegesis angle and for pacing reasons. A bit of an exposition dump in this scene, but it's a little bit better than it would be otherwise because of the end of the episode where we see Kyubei omit information. So seeing it explicate what's going on to Sayaka here is really good for the turn later because we've trusted it already to give us information that we are going off of as viewers, in exactly the same way Sayaka is. And once again, the true nature of Kyubei belied by the fact that it is like dancing with a little grief seed in a very cute way with the cute sound effects. For this explanation of the soul gems being polluted, I want to ask you something that we mentioned a bit earlier on in episode 2 and 3. Does the soul gem become polluted because, as Kyubei says, the magical girl uses too much magic? Or does the soul gem become polluted because the magical girl believes what Kyubey says about the soul gem becoming polluted because the magical girl uses too much magic? After everything that happens in this series, it would be kind of foolish to just blindly assume what Kyubey says is true. And we've already seen kind of a tenuous nature between the power of magical girls and the power of the grief seeds or what they're used for. Instead, for the sake of argument, let's come from a point where we assume that Kyubey is being unreliable, that this exposition is not to be taken at face value, instead very much the opposite. If we assume that Kyubey is even here in this basic explanation manipulating the magical girls into believing this to be true, and I don't think that's too much of an assumption as it speaks in such harsh absolutes of like, you need to go out and find more grief seeds to be able to defeat Kyoko. If we come from a basis of assuming this is a lie, or perhaps very strongly misrepresenting the information, then we're able to question everything that's presented to us as factual. If we do that, we reject the hypothesis that we need to only kill witches to get grief seeds in order to live. Thereby, we can eliminate the dilemma that Sayaka is faced with here. That would be a very convenient thing to do because it would mean that magical girls don't have to end as witches, which would be a very inconvenient thing for the incubator race. So under this presumption, we can kind of see the incubator setup as mostly systemic, a la Revolutionary Girl Utena or Yurikuma or something like that. And the act of accepting this information or buying into this structure is only enabled by the fact that the magical girls believe this to be the case. This also allows us to fit very nicely into the idea of breaking the structure or leaving the structure or overcoming that structure that they're in, and the rejection of this set-up to fail system, which is the large part of Madoka and Homura's story. So under this presumption that Kyubey is not only an unreliable narrator, but is functioning in some way as the systemic manipulator and progenitor of the system that the magical girls are in, and that the deception is really the only thing that causes the system to work in the way that it does, then we can kind of see this as more tragic and see how well it fits into the genre. I was watching an old CGP Grey video about which planet is the closest to Earth, and then he responds to his video by stating the question is inherently faulty, that you need to ask a specific question. Which planet is ever the closest? Which planet on average is the closest? Which planet takes the shortest amount of time to travel to, etc., etc. His point is that you have to ask a specific question for a specific purpose to get a specific answer. And Kyubey is very good about not answering. The question that Sayaka asks is, how was Mami able to fight without a large reserve of grief seeds? The answer that she receives is that Mami was just better at it. Ask far too general a question, get far too general an answer, one that'll misrepresent and misguide you. And even the question buys into the idea that you need grief seeds in order to use magic. Instead, I propositioned that Mami was a stronger magical girl who was able to use magic more efficiently because she truly believed in what she was doing. And I say to you that Kyoko Sakura is a much stronger magical girl because she, again, has a much stronger worldview, one that is supported and confident and that she feels comfortable believing in. This is kind of the type of thing that happens even in the real world too, that nobody really has your best interests at heart. No corporation really wants to be your friend. There's something that I found in a movie that I really took to heart and made part of my worldview. It's from the seminal work Rush Hour 2, when Chris Tucker's character states, "Follow the rich white man." Applied broadly, it means that there's always somebody trying to exploit you. There's always someone looking to take advantage of the situation. And it's usually very easy to spot if you just know who to look for. So when you see things like police brutality or economic inequality or laws being passed that disenfranchise certain groups of people, then you just need to look for who benefits from that, and then you'll be able to see who was influencing the situation. In the same way of Madoka Magica, we look for who would benefit from this system. Of course, we already know it. They say it to us in episode 11. But the only people to benefit from this relationship are the incubators. And I guess in their hyper-utilitarian viewpoint, the universe, but, you know. So if we follow the rich white man in this situation, we land back at Kyubey. And I think that underestimating it by giving it the benefit of the doubt, even assuming that it doesn't lie flat out, is is a huge mistake. Furthermore, the last thing I'll say about Kyubei's misanthropy, go with misanthropy, is that a lot of it does rely on the functions of the narrative dump character in a magical girl show. Because when Luna pops in and tells Usagi that she's the reincarnation of a princess from the moon, and that she has this miracle romance with the prince from Earth in her other life, then that is a crucial part of the story, and we need this backstory to understand the emotional impact that happens later on. So we have to trust Luna here. We don't really have any other option for this story to go forward. And of course, it's the same with Yuna and Keroberos and all the other precure fairies and whatnot. We have to trust that the glamour of what these girls are getting into is described to us and them accurately, because we don't know any better. Because it's glamour. It's by nature more than we have in our daily lives, so we don't have anything to judge against it. We can't tell a real miracle from a fake miracle. So if we think about it in terms of a genre story, this is obviously a weak link. And subverting the mascot character being trustworthy is kind of the logical step here. We know that the other part of the story, we know that the answer to all the problems is tangible and real and functional, right? The character's emotions and the compassion and love and understanding, the values that we see, those are concrete to us, or we would have a hard time telling the story without those. They're what I like to call universal ideas. The glamour of what happens, the fantasy in the story, is all a contrivance. It's always been a contrivance just to get at those issues. Just to put characters in situations where those issues can be tested and give them an opportunity to prove that those values that they hold do have meaning and power and hold up. And this is also a little bit why I don't consider Madoka Magica a deconstruction in the way that it was thrown around back when it first aired. Because the contrivance here is, yeah, the subversion of the helper character familiar, but that in and of itself is kind of insubstantial. It creates more tragedy, yes, it creates a much more interesting story that Urobuchi can throw all this deception into, yes, but at the end of the day, having a negative character in this role is not inherently different for where the show wants to go than having Luna or Artemis or the Shugochara or anything like that. The rest of the scene, very straightforward, pretty cute. I think maybe we could pull on the blue motif and that Sayaka continues to be surrounded, kind of like she's drowning. And the thing that is very important to Kyubei is Madoka contracting, and the thing that's very important to Sayaka is protecting Madoka, as both of those get close-up shots. A wonderful contrast yet again with this soft establishing shot with the ambient sounds cutting directly onto Kyoko's chomp with the dance music in the background. And then a third beat to kind of capture this environmental storytelling of don't eat while you're playing. A great bit of show don't tell to inform you as to Kyoko's mindset, particularly towards social norms and the outside world. It's not only good for the character but for the scene as well, as Homura is going to come in here and try to appeal to certain values of Kyoko. Obviously the implied benefit to all of society isn't going to really be one that she's interested in. The slow pan up next reveals that Kyoko is, of course, playing DDR, or as we can see it labeled, dog drug reinforcement, which, wow. But let's also note that the art seems to match the art from The Witch's Labyrinth. So taking these two things together, that Kyoko is spending her free time doing something athletic, doing something challenging, and something carefree, completely divorced from whatever else is going on. But that is shown by the show to have the same kind of art style as what she does as a magical girl. Then it largely tells us how Kyoko approaches fighting witches. It's a tangible challenge, a game that she can master. This is further enforced by the song that she's dancing to being a dance or chiptune remix of the opening song, Connect. This is what being a magical girl is to her. Also note that she's using a lot of effort doing this. She's also happy with it and engaged with it. This is one of the best ways to characterize a character. In 15 seconds we learn more about Kyoko Sakura than we could in just about any other way. And it's organic and it's meaningful. And also note that it's a movement in place. It's a lot of action. It's a lot of spinning your wheels. Necessarily, to do DDR, you have to be standing in the same place. Whereas Homura walks onto the screen and again towards the left. Homura is the one reaching out the olive branch here, something difficult for her, or that she doesn't necessarily have to do. Now, going back to the interaction of the scene, Kyoko, disrespectful, doesn't stop her game or turn around, but she notices Homura. The one part she does stop or turn around, or when the music fades, is when she asks, "What is your deal anyway?" That's the only thing in this conversation that Kyoko really cares about. The talk of Sayaka is already a problem that's been solved. The talk of the city's already hers if she wants it. Though the very quick shot on the pocky stick breaking does show an element of surprise in Kyoko. What's more, she's willing to entertain this conversation, though she's not, being very respectful during it. She absolutely understands working with other magical girls and is open to the idea, and she would with Sayaka too, if Sayaka wasn't so stubborn. The revealing line that we kind of catch here is that Homura wants to save Sayaka, or wants to help Sayaka. Of course, that further enforces the Homura of not evil, but we've kind of abandoned that at this point, after she saves Sayaka. But we know that she hasn't abandoned this yet, and that's kind of really weird. It's important to know that either she has her own reasons for doing it, or she's honestly taking that plea from Madoka in episode 5 to heart, which I think is clearly the more reasonable answer. Again, I want to bring these up when they pop up so that it doesn't seem like they come out of nowhere if we ever get to Rebellion. But this is a very clear example of Homura acquiescing to Madoka's wishes, or appreciating what her values are, and then acting on them and respecting them, which is just the opposite of what her character does at the end of Madoka Rebellion. But okay, I'll stop for now. I think the end shot of this scene is a bit confusing here. She gets done saying we can team up and take him on, and then kind of both girls are rewarded with the perfect screen in the background and the clapping from the song. And it really lingers here, and there is this also a very kind of weird shot of sharing food. Of course, that's something she does later on, and we come to identify that as a way that she expresses her love and respect for other people. Her whole backstory. So I think about this in the same way I think about the budget smile from Hibike Euphonium Season 1, where it's this example of a character opening up to another character in a way that is really meaningful and powerful and moves the character dynamics forward, and then being rewarded for that by the other character turning around and providing this like glamour shot to them. And honestly, if we think about it, what has been the detriment, what has been the downfall that all the magical girls have struggled with here? And it's not doing this exact thing that Homura does right here. Homura tries, in episode 3 with Mami at the start, but then gets wrapped up. And Kyoko, in her own weird way, made an effort with Sayaka, telling her how things were and how she should go about acting. And we've seen the rejection of this kind of early and understandable canonical magical girl friendship team-up aspect to be what leads to the downfall, Mami and Sayaka now. So it's fitting then that we get this excessive gratification towards the viewer, and in this scene we're from Homura's point of view, so towards Homura for reaching out in this very Sailor Moon or Nanoha-esque way. And I know we can say, and we'll talk about it when episode 10 comes up, that this doesn't happen in this timeline because of certain circumstances. And yeah, I think that's a more complicated, more nuanced discussion. However, it does eventually happen. And to be fair, I want to bring up the good parts of Madoka Magica Rebellion when the Holy Quartet goes against Homolily at the end. And they do there are numerous shots of them working together to combine their powers and be better for it. And operate like you would expect a traditional magical fighting girl team to. So I don't think she thinks of it in this way, but Homura has hit upon something true here. And I believe the show to be saying that. Of course, she's not thinking about it in that way because of the events of the timeline that we see in episode 10. However, like that metaphor we said at the end of episode 5 of the sprig of hope not refusing to be pushed down entirely or constantly springing up and up again, we see it here. We see a triumph. We see a minor victory. We see two people, at least on the surface, understand each other. And for Kyoko's part, we see trust. So barring Madoka, even now, Kyoko is probably the most magical girl-esque Madagaka that we have. Consider the pacing then on reflecting back from that high energy scene onto the very literal scars of the battle that she just inflicted. Again, numerous shots of pipes being broken, of all the water that has flown out of them being implied. Again, connecting back to Sayaka. These are very, very easy to interpret as scars on Sayaka. And that interpretation largely matches what we see from Sayaka in her dialogue over this next scene. I had to look it up because it's so good. It seems that the storyboards for episode 6 were also done by the same person who storyboarded episodes 4, 10, and 12, Shinsaku Sasaki. There's not a ton else to go off of here. I mean, he's worked on a lot, but not that I can draw from. He's done storyboards for no more than an episode or two of a number of different anime, but I can't say I know enough to get a bead on his style. And of course, who knows how much is Shinbo. However, I do think it's meaningful that Sasaki was charged with some of the better episodes of the series. Episode 10 and 12, and episode 4 we had a long diatribe about how good that opening scene is. The one that gives commentary on this episode is series director Yukihiro Miyamoto. Quotes from the wiki state that Miyamoto was slapped with a rough version of the work and told to make atmosphere. They do confirm too that Miyamoto did review every cut and specifically went back and made all these changes for the Blu-rays that we've been bringing up, including all the lighting. Again, getting out of that foggy murk of who made what and trying to attribute really good directing to one of the people who put it down and brought it forth. The symbols in this scene are still really great, and we're still in this narrow alley here. Sayaka hasn't left it. She's returned to the scene of the crime. She's clearly not moving past it, and she's clearly still thinking about things in only this binary kind of way. Note here that Madoka recommends trying to talk it out with her. This scene is placed directly after a scene where we are rewarded for Homura talking it out with Kyoko, the exact same person they're refusing to work it out with here. That is some brilliant composition on your episode. That is incredibly strong. Sayaka's line here about trying harder and harder to kill each other, it escalates with the swell of the music, and it also shows a level of dramatism to this, that Sayaka is still thinking about things in that way. She's still in this mindset of, in this hero against the villain who is very powerful, and they have to conflict back and forth. Though she already acknowledges herself by saying that it didn't start out that way, that there is possibly a talk it out resolution, and that's what Kyoko offered in the beginning of the fight. The line that Sayaka gives is, "You want me to talk to her? That's totally nuts." Implying that she thinks that if somebody used that amount of force on somebody, if Kyoko was earnestly and honestly willing to kill Sayaka, then that is a level too far. That is something that can't be redeemed. There's no reconciliation for an earnest attempt at murder. This, of course, as we've been saying, is antithetical to the magical girl ideals. I wrote once, quote, "Past this point, Sailor Moon will befriend, redeem, and indeed love murderers, rapists, pedophiles, traitorous friends, and villains guilty of far more than stealing a kiss. At no point will any case ever be clear." That is to say, one of the conceits of the magical girl genre is that there is always an eternal redemption. It is very religious in some ways. No action could ever prevent you from realizing these values or becoming a better person or being accepted and supported. And that's the one true axiom. Because when you start drilling down, when you start judging people for their methods or criticizing the way they went about things, then you're divorced from the real empathy of the situation and the real and basest human element of understanding each other and appreciating the emotions behind the intent. That's what Madoka struggles with here. She supports Sayaka. She loves Sayaka. She wants Sayaka to succeed and flourish as a magical girl and as a person. But she kind of sees this path that Sayaka is going down, and then something deep within her knows that Sayaka's actions of writing Kyoko off are, for lack of a better word, wrong. wrong, that her line of thinking is going to cause her to hurt herself. There's a lot of talk about selfish wishes here, but not nearly enough talk about selfish actions. If Sayaka is going to set up everyone else as the enemy and die on this hill, presumably in defense, in her mind, of Mami's values and the values of a hero, then she's going to hurt Madoka, which her words largely do here. Also, notice that Madoka calls out the reason Mami died. Why isn't this more talked about? Why isn't this very clear to everybody who watches this? Working together equals good, equals traditional magical girls being ripped apart or dying on this hill of doing it your way, refusing to compromise or refusing to understand the other people, equals dying, equals the Madoka Magica that we see for these episodes. It's not like it's a secret. A lot of the blame when people talk about Madoka Magica going off the rails is placed on Kyubey, is placed on Gen Urobuchi contriving this badness that these magical girls have to deal with. And yeah, in some way it's systemic and that makes them think about things in these ways. However, I think most of the blame can be attributed to people like Sayaka right here, misinterpreting Mami, and to people like Mami misinterpreting Homura. They could fight against this. They could try and establish something different. They're just emotionally too weak to see these things through. I'm reminded of that quote from Mami who said she has to want to be friends. Madoka is the only person who has the strength to submit and listen and care. Now look at the directing here on when Sayaka dives further into this. The music in the background is this very discordant tone. A slow pan up of Sayaka as she's doubled over, gripping herself, lying outright to herself, saying Homura only showed up after Mami was dead. Homura was tied and disabled by Mami. I wonder which came first. Did Gen Urobuchi write this scene and then go back and redact episode 3 to make Sayaka have an excuse to be separated from Madoka and Mami? Or was he galaxy brain enough to see this coming and need Sayaka to have a different incorrect take? Either way, I think it really captures how people can believe things that are factually incorrect. When something fits the narrative of what they want to believe and helps their argument, you can very easily rationalize away reality. Insert Adam Savage clip here.
I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Once again, very human, but very corrupting. And Madoka doesn't want to contest. She knows that's not true. But the issue of whether it's true or not isn't going to do anything, isn't going to help anything. Like, arguing with Sayaka here doesn't do anything. That doesn't attack the underlying issue of why Sayaka is being resistant to working with both Kyoko and Homura. Contesting Sayaka's warped perspective would just be a betrayal, or seen to her as a betrayal. And if it seems as if I'm beating a dead horse on this topic, I want you to know that I'm really not. In fact, that's what this entire episode is about. There's really no other conflict. When Madoka sits down with her mom in the following scenes, she's talking specifically about this dilemma. When I see somebody going astray or having values that I know are self-destructive and incorrect, but I can't attack them directly. I can't say Sayaka's mindset is wrong and she needs to check herself, because that type of intervention is only going to push her further away. How then do I come to a place where I can show this person the truth, or a way of living and worldview that doesn't result in these self-destructive actions? Evangelizing and espousing and living, indeed, these values in demonstrably good ways is really the only way to go about doing that. Again, we're back at Rei taking the hit for Kon. We're back at Naru believing in Nephrite, or Nanoha questioning why fate has such pain behind her eyes, or Duck, or Hibiki, or etc, etc. This is a really regrettable situation because it's born from compassion, right? The magical girl sees this action going on and sees this world not behaving in a way that benefits all the people and respects them and appreciates them, and then is faced with the conundrum of how to bring about the world that they want to see. And as Utna did, you must become a car. You must become a vehicle for other people to reach that place, to have a better worldview. The irony about Madoka Magica and the beauty of the show is that Madoka is specifically kept from doing that. Homer refuses to allow her to embody those values and prove them unto the world. If she could manifest as a positive example for Sayaka here, Sayaka would very likely understand and appreciate Madoka's viewpoint, and we'd have something close to the opening scene of Madoka Magica Rebellion. But getting back to the actual scene itself in episode 6, now that Sayaka's kind of had her anti-transformation here, Sayaka goes off, and her words visibly hurt Madoka, mentioning the familiar killing her parents or brother. We can even see in this shot here with full-on Sayaka's warping reality around her quite literally. And again, drawing more lines in the sand that a magical girl can be worse than a witch. One of the ideas that I want to touch on later in the episode when we introduce the concepts of soul gems as souls is the idea of reductionism and its related concept of objectification. This is really the true enemy in a lot of these shows and even beyond the genre itself in a lot of fiction. To take somebody and throw away all the parts that you don't want to have to think about and reduce them down into one simple synecdoche, one word that describes them how you want them to be described, and refusing to engage with another person in the wholeness of their personage is the worst and most cardinal of sins. And that's exactly what Sayaka demonstrates in this scene. And actually, the inverse of that, the ability to appreciate what Sayaka's going through, to accept her as a full person and support her, is precisely the quandary that Madoka is going to express in the next scene. The directing very beautiful and understated here, looking down on her restless face as she tries to sleep, plus the stuffed animals symbolizing innocence, a child's way of thinking about the world, and the simple piano keys giving a bit of clarity or ease to it, keying us in that this is going to be a very contemplative scene. Just to step back real quickly, this is one of my favorite scenes in the entire show, and probably in my top 10 or 20 in all of anime. It's probably because there's a marriage of the content and of the theming here that Gen Urobuchi even decided to include this scene. How much it is obscure and hard to really wrap your head around if we're looking directly from Madoka's perspective, but then looking back with the clarity of time and of information, we understand how important this is to Madoka as a person and the show in general. The relationship the two have, the agency that it gives Madoka to ask her mom here, and the importance that Junko has towards the series. Every time I watch this scene, every time, I'm honestly struck emotionally, and I think it's for a number of factors. First is that there's no complications. It's literally a scene of two people talking to each other. The only directing tricks that even get pulled are cutting away to the glasses. And maybe we have some symbols there of whiskey, of tips of an iceberg, something along those lines, but it's not distracting from what they're saying. So there is this very intense focus on the dialogue. Secondly, we have the callback in episode 11, right near the end, when Madoka is about to leave the storm shelter. We see the reflective writing there, that this scene in episode 6 is presumably about Sayaka making mistakes, but that it applies more realistically to Homura and what she's doing. There's actually 3 levels here. One, that Sayaka is making the mistakes, and Madoka wants to help her, presumably by attempting to do something stupid. And she's concerned about reaching Sayaka, and if Sayaka will know that this is something that Madoka does for Sayaka. 2 is that Madoka believes that Homura is on a self-destructive path, that she wants to do something stupid to be able to help Homura, her wish, which does have the added effect of helping Sayaka too, obviously. This fits very well because of the scene in episode 11 into the something stupid category. You know, going out there and making that wish, even though everything has been working towards preventing Madoka from having to engage in this system. Madoka's Madoka's wish in both these readings is the something stupid to change the setup and buck the trends. The final reading is, of course, if Junko was talking to Homura, that Madoka continuously dives upon the sword again and again, that she won't stop dying for the sake of the world and the people she loves. And if Homura is trying to stop Madoka from achieving this or meeting this grisly end, then she needs to do something stupid too, or something that wouldn't be expected, or doesn't play into the system by which Madoka keeps buying into. And the marriage of those last two readings, the marriage of Homura doing something wrong, and that causing Madoka to be in this position where she feels she needs to do something wrong in response, and that Madoka's wish is only enabled by Homura's actions of resetting time to tie the bonds of fate into Madoka, is all the accumulation of this reflective writing in this scene and what makes it so beautiful. Add in all these things and the importance of family in a magical girl show, everything we said in episode 1 about Junko as someone who has survived her trials, or a magical girl who grew up or completed or chose her path and told her story and moved on. Then add in this kind of like personal element of this relationship with a parent and a child in this idealized way of this is good parenting. Just like in episode 1 where she imposed upon Madoka her value as a person and that she should behave like she has value because she does. It's much the same here. This is Junko providing ethical guidance, a sort of empowerment to Madoka simply by virtue of listening to her and treating her like a person. In many ways, Junko, that is, attempts to do what Kyoko attempts to do in the following episode with Sayaka, to reach out a hand and meet the person where they are. It strikes me personally as emotional because it's not something that I ever received from a parent growing up, or any type of adult figure or anything like that. Or if I did, it was in fits and starts from coaches and teachers and other type of leaders. So it feels even more poignant in my mind. And as a critic of writing, I'm just astonished that Urobuchi would put this here, would take the time and say, no, this is what we need, for how well it reflects upon the previous scene with Sayaka and how well it is called back to later in the series, even with the Junko drinking with the teacher in episode 11. Let's go line by line, just out of my appreciation for this scene. Madoka opens with, there's this friend of mine. Junko doesn't ever bring up Sayaka. Ever. She doesn't need to. She probably could guess, but why? That's just a level of respect that blows my mind. Let her talk in hypotheticals. Don't belittle her and try and peel back and see what's behind these hypothetical statements. Junko's face as she's listening, actively listening to what Madoka is saying. What we just got done saying about the previous scene comes in, that Madoka correctly analyzes that Sayaka is trying to do the right thing, but the more she tries and the more she gets more resolved in that, the worse it gets for her. That the conflict is still there of being unable to tell somebody that they're wrong because they're not really wrong in intentions, they're just emotionally in a bad place, not logically, emotionally. Junko, after listening, responds in kind. That she doesn't give a specific example, she keeps it on the level that Madoka brought it, and just provides some advice from somebody who has experience in these types of matters. 3 times in Junko's response, she mentions that this is going to end badly. That this line of thinking that Madoka has described, and correctly analyzed, mind you, has the core issue what's going on in this story and preventing things from being happy. This core issue is deleterious. It is pernicious. It is going to result in an unhappy story. Junko just says it flat out here. We mentioned that back in episode 4 with Sayaka's intro scene, that she warns us this is going to happen, and here Junko just reinforces it for Sayaka, and 2 for Homura if we reflect it onto her. Madoka doesn't even try to hide the surprise on her face. And her next line is that that's illogical, right? It's unfair. Junko acknowledges and once again says that's not going to help anything. And then of course she floats the idea of of doing something wrong or drastic or transgressive. This is given a lot of weight by the directing here, as Madoka looks up and is surprised by it, and then the music kind of swells in with the horn coming in as like a dawn rising, taps kind of Sound of the Sky-esque tune. And then let us look at the directing here as the two are placed on the same level, seeing eye to eye, but with Junko giving this advice with a much lighter element to her, or a much lighter contrast and tone, which, if we call back to that color theory that we talked about last episode, this pure whiteness of Junko's bathrobe is kind of symbolizing that ultimate Madoka, or that evolved, resolute, and resolved magical girl who has their path and walks it. The other element that Junko brings up is that you can make the wrong kind of mistakes. As you get older, the mistakes get more heavy and weighty, and this feels a little bit like an older man writing a magical girl show, I think. Or this awareness comes up in this real Carrie Kano kind of way that you kind of feel like a teenager wouldn't say that, but Junko's not a teenager, so there's no dissonance. And maybe this line, I think, is one of the most powerful, because it really does feel like a loving letter of reinforcement to all magical girls, that she's kind of saying that you're going to make your judgments here, you're going to find out what's worth fighting for in this teenager as an adolescent, and coming out of that into an adulthood, you're going to be questioned again and again of who you are and what's worth fighting for, what's worth dying for. And this battle is not going to be your last battle. You will fight this glamour of this alien race, and all magical girls have their different struggles and their things that they go through, but then they come out of it on the other side, and they will have used what they learned there in this coming of age way to manifest as a person and become someone who they can be confident in being. That ultimately being a magical girl is a fight against suicide, that it's a fight of self-discovery. And once you complete this glamour of what this little creature has told you must go on and all this magic bullshit, then you're still going to be duck on a pond with Fakir, that you're still going to move on to the next thing. You're going to have another trial that's going to come up and fight outside of the scope of this story. There'll be another magical girl that'll come in and have to find herself. But your next battle will be something else. Something outside of the realm of transformation sequences, where you won't need a frilly dress and a German-speaking staff to be able to fight back against it. You'll have some other tools and some other pain to endure, but you will be equipped and armored and able to fight that because of what you've gone through here. Because of your time as a magical girl. Because you learned who you are and what you value in the world and what you want to give meaning to. And you'll look back on those times no less seriously, or not considering them trite or anything of the sort, but you'll look back on those times and you'll think, I grew. I became someone else. And that fight and those lessons made me who I am today. Junko here is legitimizing the entire struggle of the magical girl and expressing how very valuable it is. And as we see Homura in episode 12, as we see Sayaka in Rebellion, and as we see Madoka's actions on episode 12, then we really know how right Junko was in what she said here. This is, I believe, the last time that we view this exact opening shot, and all our other familiar symbols are back here for one last swan song to Sayaka's hospital boy romance arc. The dashing forward to the left, having the CD, the sun setting, the wind again, the lack of the flower, the overly extreme shadows. And it's not difficult to read what's going on here in the subtext of the scene. She's so excited to to be rushing forward with the new CD in her hands. She's so visibly crushed when Kyosuke is not there that it's really easy to take this then as her comfort zone, especially since we've been viewing it for so long now. It's very good then that this scene doesn't last any longer and it cuts immediately right to something that we've never seen before. These streetlights, this large Japanese-style home, the lack of the familiar and inviting light. When Sayaka hesitates to enter as Kyosuke plays, we get a feeling of not only that this issue is resolved in some way, but also that Sayaka is terrified here. She's out of her depth, and she doesn't really know how to approach the situation. So, perfect introduction for Kyoko, right? If Kyoko's role last episode was to question Sayaka's beliefs surrounding magical girls and witches and not letting other people get hurt, her role here is to question Sayaka's ability to leave this here, or her acquiescence, to question the faith she has behind her wish, and whether or not she can live with herself and how selfish it was. To do this, she lays down her method of thinking that magic should only be used for oneself. And knowing that it'll press Sayaka's buttons, she mentions Mommy's name again. What's more, she explicitly mentions the conditions that Kyosuke was in the hospital and being able to replicate those now. Break his arms and his legs and he'll be entirely reliant on you. This is really good because this was the situation that Sayaka was so enamored with, or that she was so comfortable with. Kyoko, and Urobuchi as an extension, is putting the finger directly on the issue that Sayaka is being weak to right now. She hasn't yet faced the realization that Kyosuke may go on living without her as an active participant in his life. She doesn't know what that can mean, and she's reeling at this first experience of it. Kyoko's just accelerating that. Again, she's doing it in the same kind of brazen and offensive style that she did last episode. However, Kyoko is honestly trying to help. She knows that this issue is going to ruin Sayaka. Also, isn't Kyoko deliberately going against the pact she made with Homura earlier? She's engaging with Sayaka purposefully, with the intention probably to incite her to violence. Perhaps that's why we don't see Homura right now. She put some amount of trust in that scene with Kyoko. Though going back and watch it, Kyoko never promises not to incite Sayaka or deal with Sayaka. She only promises to team up with Homura in regards to Walpurgis Nacht. Perhaps this then is Kyoko's sin, or one of the reasons she doesn't get a happy end. While she does try to reach out to Sayaka and help her in the end, she doesn't do the same for Homura. Or maybe we need to think about it a bit more. We'll come back to that. Anyway, the directing here I don't think is particularly special. A lot of the symbols we've seen already for Kyoko. And it's carried mostly by the strength of the vocal performances. That's something that came up in one of the interviews actually that I was reading for research, that the creators lamented that the foreign versions wouldn't be as good as the original Japanese because the original Japanese was animated based on the vocal performances. And using very high quality voice actors for this, they were able to get some really amazing and outstanding performances. The final note here is that Kyoko recommends physical violence, and against an innocent. It's a really easy and in-character way of showing that Kyoko doesn't hold these same high-minded values that Sayaka does of protecting people. But more than that, it kind of calls out this tendency of Sayaka to want to take care of someone, have them dependent on her in the way that, you know, is brung up later. Pressing on, I don't have a reading on Hey Diddle Diddle. It's a nonsense poem, right? A nursery rhyme for children. Maybe that's portraying Madoka as innocent. It's certainly portraying her as studious, of course. She's doing her homework after having that discussion with her mom where it was like, you need to act, you need to do something. Playing by the rules, certainly. And doing, as Homer said, the appreciation of the normal everyday life. The text of Hey Diddle Diddle, or that she's translating it from Japanese to English, I don't know, I'm welcoming all readings here, even crack theories about how this is clearly about the budding romantic relationship between Sayaka and Kyoko. The little dog laughed, and that's Kyubei, probably, and then The dish and the spoon are Kyoko and Sayaka, and they're running away together. Cat and a fiddle, clearly Kyosuke, and a cow jumping over a moon, an impossible task. Let's attribute that to Homura and her quest, which Kyubei, as the little dog, would certainly find very funny. I don't know, as a basic exercise on readings and how you can attribute meaning to where there's probably none intended on the author's side. But that's only ever half the puzzle, right? Anyway, Homura's blind side here is that she lets Kyubei contact Madoka. It's a pretty stark contrast to that one shot we see later in the series where Homura kills Kyubei, pops up right outside Madoka's window. I love panning up on the establishing shot to the fight on the bridge. Gives it a good, cheap, really resource-light sense of distance and scale. And the very futuristic style of this overpass really maintains that same linear feel of the back alley, but in a more spread out space, kind of indicating that there are more options here, but there's still this very narrow path that these girls are set upon, with Kyoko blocking the way to the left once again. Kyoko, to her credit, has a very Sailor Moon transformation sequence here. The standard colored silhouette and the pops on the shoes and dress appearing and then landing on the soul gem appearing, plus striking a pose like she's Sailor Mars or something. And Madoka comes in with her act of agency, her act of doing the wrong thing. Let's take this in 3 parts. First, the actual directing of the scene. It's a very dramatic scene, right? So there's a lot of quick cuts, a lot of close-ups of people's faces, a lot of off-kilter angles, and even a zoom in on Madoka's eye yet again. It's pretty traditional in a lot of those ways. We need to see how hard this is hitting other people, as this is really kind of the second emotional beat in the show after Mommy dying. So it's really justifiable where it's set as a horror scene, and the tone is really the strong point here, and really the thing that people remember from Madoka Magica, even though they may not remember the specifics. It's very good tonally to see Homura struggling and everybody else reeling as Kyubei monologues in that monotone voice. It's also the first real time we see Kyubei deliberately, maliciously withholding information. And of course, malicious can be, in quotes, because this doesn't really practically affect the girls negatively, but that's not what we're going for in this scene. We're instead looking for more of an emotional response here, judging by the reaction shots and the tone. 2 other motifs that we see generally in the directing are a lot of top-down shots, showing them as being looked down upon, like they're lab rats in a test, or otherwise enclosed. Yet again, we see a bit of time dilation, too, on a number of the shots, like zooming in on Kyoko. Gives a lot of weight behind what's being said, or how the girls are taking it. Switching gears to looking at it through character dynamic point of view, Homura calls Kyoko on her engagement with Sayaka. So we see here Kyoko performing that act of betraying the other magical girls that Mami and Sayaka and Homura all have done already, and her kind of flimsy rationalization to justify it. Homura once again goes out of her way to not only protect Sayaka by attempting to stop the fight, thereby honoring Madoka's wishes like we said earlier in the episode, but also that she goes after the soul gem. If she were purely utilitarian, there'd be no real reason to go through all that effort. She knows Sayaka's going to die anyway, or that's not going to help Madoka avoid becoming a magical girl. So it really is an act of compassion and understanding for either Madoka's values or Sayaka as a person. Either way, that's an act that betrays the impression that Sayaka would have of Homura. Furthermore, it tells us that Homura has additional information that she hasn't shared with anybody, and it leads into the hoodwink of her being a time traveler in episode 10. I think even if you thought about it for a little while, you would kind of see this as time stopping and not just random short teleportation. So let's get down to it, and the thing we promised at the beginning of this episode of the soul gems as soul gems. Here's my take. The soul gems do look meaningfully different than something like a compact. Kyubei here has dialogue about it being their actual souls, and that being the only thing that matters. Now we could go back and kind of, pick and prod at things like the legendary silver crystal being a representation of Sailor Moon's life force, and this just being a further codification of that, which is something Madoka Magica has been doing in a lot of aspects. Not transformation sequences, strangely enough. But anyway, Usagi in the Sailor Moon R movie, when the legendary silver crystal breaks, then she dies. So we've kind of got that level of importance to these, not like a magical do-re-mi transformation doodad. So it makes sense that these are a little more glamorous, right? Now, the soul gem itself is this kind of color of the girl and then bounded in the gold, kind of like a fancy prison. And in that way, the vulnerability of the soul gem is very good. It provides a more tangible and weighty bit of specific crunch to the combat or the magic system. But what does that mean, though, that the soul is ripped from the body? There's this humanist element, or a natural kind of feeling that our souls inhabit our bodies, where your soul entirely lives inside your brain, if you think about it logically. So yeah, removing the vulnerability of your head and placing it in a more defensible position makes rational sense. But it feels so unnatural when we remove this soul, this kind of intangible thing, and make it into something tangible. That feeling of this is wrong or this is an affront to nature is what the girls are reacting to here. And that emotional reaction is, of course, why Kyubei's race wouldn't deem it necessary to share this information with the girls. Of course, it is not natural. I mean, magical girls aren't natural. And Kyubei's race is entirely preying on teenage girls because they have these heightened emotions. I am kind of ashamed that I see it more from Kyubei's point of view than I do from the girls. So I myself have in the past taken a lot of time and thought about this act. Even, divorced from the thriller, horror aspect of this scene, what makes it so offensive to the girls? And how can I kind of connect with them emotionally where I'm kind of on Kyubei's side on this one? Well, I think the thing that helped me the most is thinking about the soul gem, going back to it as a prison or removing it from the body. There's this element of stopping. This temporal freeze that is in many ways associated with the wish that the girl makes to extract the soul gem, which to the show's credit we have seen at the start of episode 5. That at the time that the girl contracts, her scope is such that she will make her wish based on something going on in her life. And we've talked a lot about growing up, especially in this episode, of defining yourself and coming out the other side, or this being just one struggle in your life. And the kind of really offensive thing about this act of removing the soul here is that it's a reduction and a permanent one. One of the best and most enlightening things I've done is gone through the Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, one of my favorite anime movies, scene by scene. And one of the large takeaways that I got from that was that there's an indescribable harm in reducing a character, in labeling somebody, in writing them off, in refusing to accept them in their totality. And now I see that here in the wish and in the removal of the soul from the body. That in asking someone to have just one wish, that is asking you above all else, what do you want? What do you value? What is your judgment on the world and the life that you lead? And how do you want to be forever defined? Answering something like that should be impossible. We as humans don't have just one aspect. If you'd rather poetry, Walt Whitman in my favorite poem, "Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Look in my face while I snuff the sidle of evening. Talk honestly, no one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And throughout all of Madoka Magica, we see the pernicious nature of the wish. When it defines somebody, when it completely rewrites who they are, and the girl's struggling against it. See it in Sayaka when she makes her wish for one boy and then the boy leaves her. She chose to be somebody that helped Kyosuke, and that meant giving up everything else. See it in Kyoko when she defines herself by how she can help her father, when that all comes cascading down around her, and then she's left with no identity, and has to construct one out of this very basic, very animalistic way of surviving. See it in Mami, who never even had the opportunity to give herself that identity, and was forever lost because of it. And most easily see it in Homura, who sacrificed literally everything else that she was, although admittedly, and she would say as much, that wasn't much to begin with. But now she's not a human, she's not a full person any longer. She's defined her entire existence by saving Madoka Kaname, the wish that she made in that one emotional moment. And because for all four of them, their wish doesn't live up to the grandeur of what they would and could be as human beings in their totality, their identities are robbed, their lives are damned. This is what Junko spoke on earlier. One choice, one failure is not everything you are, and this too shall pass. But unfortunately not for the Puella Magi here. And while Kyubey enables this, yes, sure, and while there is a plot structure that requires this of them, the main gist is that it's incredibly unfair and impossible to live with yourself like this. As Homura rallies against in the first episode, having given away everything that you hold dear for just one aspect of yourself, you're a husk. You're a doll. You're a machine. You're not human any longer. The important distinction between what Homura fights against and what Madoka does, it lies in this very distinction. If a normal wish reduces the girl to one aspect, and that's invalid or impossible to live with, then Madoka reducing herself to nothing, purely out of the compassion for everyone, is on a completely different spectrum. This is talked a lot about in the text of the show itself with selfish versus selfless wishes. By selfishly wishing, you give yourself an identity and end up reducing yourself. By selflessly wishing, your identity truly has nothing to do with you. And the removal of the soul from the body, while it has little tangible relevance, the emotional weight there is symbolic of the entire burden that the show has asked of these girls. In fact, the only people I would trust with, making a wish and playing with their soul in that way is somebody like Junko, who's already played out their story and already lived their life and could make an informed decision there. The offensive nature of the Soul Gem Act is the severity of the ramifications that follow. And this too, this permanence, is a large part of why Homura would see the eventuality of becoming a witch as something permanent. It is a one-way street. And now these girls are weaponized. They are machines. They are soldiers that can't be unmade. It's kind of gunslinger girl almost, right? And that permanent transformation is not something that the girls weighed when they made their decision. Whether or not it practically matters, it's still the fact that Kyubey didn't tell them about this specific aspect of being a magical girl. I'm not in a relationship myself, but if anybody is, then you certainly know it's not what you did, it's the fact that you didn't tell them about it. Really a tale as old as time. And I don't think it's just an American thing, but I think the Americans take very strongly to this. But being denied information by somebody else, even purposefully, even if that person does have your best interests in mind, that act is something we see come up again and again in our fiction as a deal breaker, because you're not treating the people as equals. You're saying, I know better than you, so I'm going to make this decision without you or for you. And that's why Kyubey's epistemic loops kind of ring hollow in episode 11. Oh really? You're the good guys because you asked for their consent without providing the full details of the contract? Well, sure, yes, not technically fraudulent misrepresentation under US law. This would largely be deemed as some sort of dirty dealing and is generally unacceptable to humans. In this way of entrapping the girls, in this way of removing their agency or chipping away at their free will, Kyubey is now very clearly the enemy. And in the tone, in the direction, in the innocence of Sayaka as she wakes up here, we as viewers fundamentally understand that everything has really changed. And the shifting character dynamics that are brought about by Madoka's act of stupidity, of intentionally doing the wrong thing, will indeed move the rest of the story forward and cause reconciliation and further descent into madness. A last quick idea. This could have been a contrivance. It could have been a quick little thing like Kyoko knocks off Sayaka's soul gem and it falls. But no, they put all this weight behind it. They put all that scene there of Madoka talking to her mother. They made Madoka do it actively. They justified it intradiegetically. I know I've said this like 5 or 6 times already, but that's what good writing looks like. How prescient Junko's words were, and how interesting and devious the path. I think the next bit of Madoka Magica is a slide. We've talked a lot about causality, but from here on out there are less callbacks and more revelations. The pacing picks up very quickly, and the emotions and the drama only weigh all the more heavy. So join us next time as we'll go in depth on some of the more beautiful and well-directed scenes in the franchise, like Kyoko's backstory and the fight against Elsa Maria, as the show is finished with its setup and now is just pure emotional roller coaster. Look forward to it.